Uh, yeah, thanks about it. So today, well, let me start with yesterday. Yesterday was the day on which these two books were published. I'm not quite sure what they mean by published because they were available beforehand in some countries, and there was no launch as such because of COVID. The Bloomsbury offices were closed. But technically yesterday was the day that it was launched. And also yes, today is in some senses the next day in the rest of my life. And so I want to sort of use that the arrival of this book, this and then talk about what's going to be the next book in the light of the book that's just come out. So um, anyway, the book, and maybe I can say just a few words about the book, just to introduce it. Um, um, what I find interesting is that in the space of about 2 years, suddenly AI has come onto the horizon and is influencing people in a remarkable way. What I'm showing you here is a straightforward GAN. It's a style GAN, one of the very earliest, I think probably the earliest actually in terms of architecture. It's the work of Refik Anadol. And what is interesting, and what it's doing is hallucinating potential buildings on using a data set of Zaha Hadid images. And this kind of stuff is well known now. My students are all doing this in the design studio. We work on GANs and so on. But when it first came out, it was quite remarkable. And what was interesting also that in right before it came out, this was I think February of 2019, I applied to curate the British Pavilion in in the Venice Biennale, and I was teaming up with Zaha Hadid Architects and with Google. Google were going to sponsor the whole thing, and this was to my mind, an absolute dream team. I mean, and we were going to work with Refik Anadol and so on. We were going to do all these things, and we didn't even. We were not only did we not get in, we weren't even shortlisted. We weren't even shortlisted in a pretty long shortlist of seven applicants. And yet, in the space of 2 years, something's different has happened, and we're now in a very different area. And I don't think that, well, maybe who knows, that such a proposal would be rejected outright now. What is interesting about what we were planning to do by the time the Venice Biennale opened, and of course it opened late, but was to be able to hallucinate buildings. Hallucinate buildings, in a sense, precisely as something is being hallucinated now. And we imagined the possibility of generating a Zaha building, of Refik Anadol using some of his techniques to hallucinate a building, something that never been done before. And what's interesting is that although we weren't appointed, didn't get anywhere near the Venice Biennale, nonetheless, in a sense, that collaboration happened because, and you can see here, an image emerging out of this Zaha Hadid project, as Refik Anadol style GANs like that. And that, in fact, was the image that we used on the front cover of the book. So it came out of a kind of collaboration that didn't actually happen, but did happen. It happened in the sense that this is the result of this kind of work. So we went. It appeared this work appeared ahead of time before we expected even, and we're capable now of hallucinating buildings. But so what I want to talk about today is the context of my next book. The AI. Well, actually, the title is not correct, but this is just simply the layout. The point being that I was working on this book for some time over the summer of 2019, and in fact, the book was going to be a book critiquing or looking at the negative aspects of AI. And as I was working on it, I realized that you had to explain what was AI in the first place. And most people have got very little idea about what AI is. They somehow think it's something like Sophia the robot or something. And they don't even realize they're kind of completely surrounded by AI in their everyday existence. So your Gmail is filtering out spam using AI. Your WeChat's translating. Your friends on Facebook are being recognized through AI. Your music's been selected on Spotify. Your car is if you're straying out of lane, it'll bleep. All these different things. And Gmail is predicting the end of your sentence. All these different things are actually all examples of AI. We're actually surrounded by, inundated with AI, except we don't know it because we can't see it. It's kind of, in some senses, invisible. So if you want to think AI, don't think humanoid robots, think algorithms. It's all about algorithms. So, but I felt that in order to kind of critique AI, I had to basically explain AI because there wasn't a book as such out there, and I found myself in a compromised position of trying to explain AI, but also critique AI. It seemed to be extremely compromised. So in the end, I decided to write two books. One is the book on the left-hand side, the white cover book, like the angel, which is looking at the positive side of AI, the amazing kind of things it can do. And one on the right-hand side was going to be the dark side of AI, looking at the negative potential of AI. So they're kind of inverted and flipped, and the image itself is inverted and flipped. But what is interesting in some ways is that actually the logic of the dark side emerges out of the logic of the white side. They're not as disconnected as one might think. So this was the title of a lecture I gave a few weeks ago at UC Santa Barbara, and I'd forgotten the title I'd given them, and it sounds a very positive title. And I wanted to start critiquing, looking at the dark side of AI, because I'm moving on to the next book, as it were. So this was a title, but actually I realized that you can just simply invert that title in the sense that you can actually look at you can find the terrifying aspects of AI out of its very capabilities. So that's what I'm going to do today. In fact, I'm not really going to refer to any new material at all. No new material. It's all pretty much, I think, in the book itself, in the positive book, as it were. But I want to talk about the dark side of AI. Now, we're all used to the positive sides of AI, the amazing things that it can do. I'm sure that here at the bar, many people are using GANs. I do the whole time with my students at FIU. We work with Daniel Bolojan, who was responsible for this, which is probably, to my mind, the leading example of AI so far, the Deep Himmelblau project by Coop Himmelblau that Daniel masterminded. I mean, there are plenty of people out there who claim they're doing AI, and they kind of somehow use Grasshopper or something else to make it neater at the end, I think, but nobody has been rigorously applying AI, to my mind, as much as Daniel Bolojan and the Coop Himmelblau project, which is going on for years now. And so what you can see here is basically a data set that's based on all the previous buildings designs by Coop Himmelblau, and it's hallucinating other possible buildings. And this is extraordinary. And this is, to my mind, it may be, I'm not quite sure how far you can go with GANs, but this is by far the most advanced, and I'm very impressed with what Daniel has done. And this is another study they did of this Deep Himmelblau project, where they're actually using cycle GANs, and they're pairing up two unmatched data sets, and they're using here clouds. And then buildings become part of the clouds. And if you think about Coop Himmelblau, which is all about both Himmelbau and Himmelblau, so it's like building clouds. Himmelbau would mean sky building, and Himmelblau would be sky blue. So it's somehow, this is a beautiful one because it sums up this whole thing. So anyway, I'm sure you've seen some of this work. It's nothing new, but this is part of the astonishing new capabilities that are coming out. And in many ways, this is a bit old hat. This came out, I think March this year. And also, we're seeing things that are being done in the studio. VQGAN and CLIP has made it a lot easier. We've been using cycle GANs and style GANs in the studio, but this is, I think, something that's kind of new and short circuits some of the problems and so on. And this is the work of Giovanna Palaca, who is just appointed a professor in Peru, who was doing this as part of the workshop, Digital Futures workshop last summer. And she's hallucinating that the prompt is futuristic Indian temple, and the pre-prompt is Yan Sung Ma, Wolf Pricks, and Tom Main. And out of this, something is coming out of the computer, which is truly astonishing in many ways and mind-blowing to my mind, what's been achieved. So we all know the capabilities of AI, at least with those of us in the more progressive schools of architecture, or those of us in more running more progressive studios. It's to my mind, it's something that is astonishing. It's going to revolutionize architecture. And Matthias Del Campo and I were editing an AD on the issue, which we've just finished. We just completed. It'll come out in March, I think, or early next year anyway. And we take the view this is the first genuinely 21st century um, design strategy. So it's something that is really mind-blowing in some ways, astonishing that it can do these things. I mean, there are limitations, of course. This is just two-dimensional. It's very uncontrolled, and there are lots of limitations. But nonetheless, you can see the possibilities of what this domain can offer. It's really really quite powerful. But there's a dark side, um, and no one knows better than Elon Musk. Somebody who uses AI in everything he does, deep, his work with on both at SpaceX or Tesla, and also the I'm blanking now on the implant of the brain. But so lots of he's using AI throughout, and yet he's warning us. There's a dark side to this. Um, Now, I don't take the kind of typical view about the dark side of AI. Those who go on about surveillance and about even about the dangers of AI and so on. I don't take that view, and I'm showing you here a video that was put together by actually some AI leading AI figures of AI about the dangers of Slaughterbots. It's a little video called Slaughterbots, and it's about what happens if you let loose these autonomous weapons and how dangerous they can be. My point is this: is if you take the view that AI is either good or bad, just inherently in and of itself, you're subscribing to the logic of what is called technological determinism. And that seems to me completely stupid. It's not a question of the thing itself; it's how you use it or who uses it and in what way. So you could have a kitchen knife that could be, you could murder someone with a kitchen knife, or you could just use a kitchen knife to go and slice up your vegetables. So I don't take the view that AI is negative in itself. I take the view that it's really a question of kind of use. But there is, I think, a dark side to AI, and it's due to its incredible potential. Some people think that, I guess the two camps broadly are AI is amazing and it's fantastic, and AI is absolutely terrifying. There's also actually a third camp, which I belong to, which is to say that AI is terrifying. AI is amazing and terrifying. I find it terrifyingly amazing, terrifyingly capable, and that I think is the dark side of AI, is how it's going to leave us behind. So I first gave a version of this um, in Korea for obvious reasons, and I'll explain in some ways. But the Korean flag has within it the yin yang sign, the idea that somehow opposites entities contain their opposites in some ways. That almost like the dialectical dialectical logic, as it were, where something is surprisingly contains its opposite. The example I always give is Zizek, who's talking about how the photograph and the movie are actually more connected than you think, in the sense that the photograph is a frozen moment out of an animated continuum, but a movie is an animated continuum that's effectively stitching up all those photographs into one continuous thing. So they're not so different, and so hence the yin yang sign, where you've got a little black circle on the white side and a little white circle on the black side, seems to me kind of quite a good emblem to start with, because I want to talk about, in a sense, how out of the white book that's been published, the dark side is already apparent. And as I say, I'm not going to really mention anything today. Well, maybe a few things that are not already in the book. I'm just going to twist them in a way to show you how terrifyingly amazing they are. So I want to talk today about a game, a game that took place in Korea, a game that was watched by millions and millions of people who were transfixed by it. A game that really was more than a game; it was a game changer, and a game that, in some senses, led to the destruction of a whole number of people, of a whole number of agents or actors within that domain. But I'm not talking about Squid Game. I'm not talking about Squid Game. Um, I'm talking about another game that took place in Korea in 2016 between AlphaGo and Lee Sedol. AlphaGo was the AI program that was developed by DeepMind in London, led by Demis Hassabis and Lisa Doll, was pretty much the kind of the world leader at the time in terms of Go, a really a talented player. And this kind of followed on from the match between Deep Blue and Garry Kasparov in 1997 at chess, where uh, where everyone was surprised, but Garry Kasparov was beaten. But when you're dealing with Go, you're dealing with a different order because when with Go, you can't just rely on expert systems as they did with Deep Blue. I mean, Deep Blue basically was trained on all possible moves that had been made in the game of chess. But there are more moves in a game of Go than there are atoms in the universe. In other words, although it's a very simple game to play, it's infinitely complicated, infinitely complex in terms of its strategy. So what you had to do was a learning strategy. And there were three networks that were used by DeepMind in this: a value network, a policy network, and a Monte Carlo tree search in order to go and develop something that could work with such a complex scenario. And everybody expected Lisa Doll to win. Certainly the whole of the Go community could not imagine the possibility of such a leading player being beaten at such a complex game. You know, AI could have been chess, but this was absolutely a different order. But what happened took everyone by surprise. It wasn't a complete whitewash in the sense that Lisa Doll won one match, but AlphaGo won the other four. And this sent shockwaves throughout the world. Shockwaves that had ramifications way beyond the game of Go. And way beyond the AI itself. It led to, in the context of, and this is the comments that Lisa Doll was coming up with yesterday, I was surprised, but today I'm speechless. I'll explain later why he was speechless after that particular game too. It really had a profound impact, and I don't think people have realized precisely what this simple game was in terms of a game changer in many ways. It was, according to Kai-Fu Lee. Kai-Fu Lee, I should say, is he's from Taiwan. He's one of the world's leading AI experts, but he did his PhD in the States, so he knows China, the world of China, Greater China, shall we say, and the States very well. And he wrote this book, AI Superpowers, looking at the kind of the race, as it were, to become a superpower, the race between China and the States, between Silicon Valley and essentially and Shenzhen, because that's largely where much of the AI is in China. And he refers to this as a Sputnik moment because it caused an absolute shock in China. It caused a shock. I mean, to us, a game of Go means nothing, right? Because we don't play Go. But in China, the game of Go is the national game. And it literally sent shockwaves through China. And the way Kai-Fu Lee described it is as the Sputnik moment. The Sputnik moment, the shock of this thing that really galvanized China into investing into AI. And of course, the Sputnik moment itself refers to the time, I think it was 57, when the Russians, the Soviet Union, sent a satellite into space ahead of America. And America was shocked by this and that were behind in the space race. And that's what led to the foundation of NASA and to going to the moon and so on and so on and so on. It's something that really set America off in the space race. And it did the same in terms of China, in terms of AI. President Xi, within a year and a half, gave the equivalent of JFK's speech about going to the moon, talking about how China was going to invest in AI with a view to overtaking the States by 2030. I would say, I spent a lot of time in China. I would say that's probably, pessimist or optimist. I think it'll happen before then. The investment they're pouring into AI is astonishing. And it wasn't just China that would the benefit. It was also Korea, where the match took place, where even more immediately, just 2 days after the match, the Korean president announced that they were going to invest in this, thanks to the AlphaGo shock. And then, of course, other countries too, it rippled throughout the world. And famously, of course, Putin has said, whoever's ahead in AI rules the world. It's clear that something is happening, and it came out of this particular match. at least the message came out of this particular match, a high-profile match that was watched by millions of people in China and Korea. But if we think that AlphaGo, actually, it was called afterwards, it was called AlphaGo Lee, after the Lee Sedol, the opponent, and after that there were several different versions of AlphaGo that were developed. AlphaGo Zero was the next one, and this was truly astonishing. Even though it wasn't so high profile, there wasn't a documentary made about it as it was about the first AlphaGo Lee. Nonetheless, it is truly astonishing. AlphaGo Zero took on AlphaGo Lee and won 100 games to 0. It just whitewashed it. So whatever they'd achieved that in that match against Lee Sedol, that system was completely outclassed by this. It also, and this is the most remarkable aspect of it in many ways, was the fact that it taught itself to play Go without knowing the rules. It did not know the rules even, and it taught itself. I don't even know how that is possible. I don't know how it's possible. But it taught itself to play Go by using reinforcement learning, by playing against itself. And AlphaGo Zero played 4.9 million games of Go against itself in 3 days. Now that sounds like a lot. 3.9 million, 4.9 million in 3 days. It sounds like a huge amount. But actually, when you start looking at it, what it means, it's even more terrifying than that, because what it means basically is it's 20 games per second. It's playing 20 games of Go per second against itself. And I mean, that is simply unimaginable. It's not completely unimaginable, actually, because I'm showing you here a hummingbird, which a hummingbird actually does beat its wings faster than 20 per second. It goes up to 50. But nonetheless, in this slow motion thing where you're seeing a hummingbird at roughly 4 or 5 beats per second, I imagine that 4 or 5 times faster. That's what we're talking about. Something that is just beyond our comprehension. I mean, it's bad enough to learn the game of Go without knowing the rules, but this is the speed at which it's done is just something at a way that everybody should be blown away with. No one seems to have remarked on this, but this seems to be the most incredible thing: the speed at which it played. So I want to look at the game just in some detail, but I want to focus on one particular move 37 in game 2, because what interests me is not whether or not it won the game, but the manner in which it won the game. That is absolutely astonishing to me. And what I mean by this is this particular move, and this is the move here, the black move made by AlphaGo onto the 5th line, which is very unusual. And the point I want to make is that most Go players operate through a form of intuition. They can't really predict too far ahead, so they're kind of working through intuition, which of course is a form of intelligence, but it's not made disclosed in some sense. It's not so obvious, but they base it on intuition. AlphaGo was operating in a different sort of way. What happened in the match is that after this move, 37, these 2 black pieces on the left-hand side here gradually fight their way across the board until they link up with this one here 100 moves later. 100 moves later. Now, maybe it wasn't calculating all those 100 moves, but nonetheless, one is tempted to think, well, maybe it was. In which case, again, one is blown away by the capability of this system that we can't think more than 1 move ahead, and it's thinking possibly 100 moves ahead. I want to play Demis Hassabis, who is talking about this, because what is interesting about this particular move, and not just this move, but a whole series of moves in that game that were referred to as slack moves, is that nobody at all realized the significance of these moves until much later. In fact, most people thought it was a mistake. They thought it was a computer glitch. This is a mistake. No one would ever play that move. It'd never been played before, and it was on the wrong line, and so on and so on. What a dumb move. But then, and apparently, according to the story, Lee Sedol smiled because he thought it was a glitch, and certainly others thought it was a glitch, a mistake. But it wasn't. It was one of the most brilliant strategic moves ever made in Go, and now it's transformed the game of Go forever. So I want to play Demis Hassabis, who is the CEO of DeepMind in London, a company now owned by Google, that are world leaders in this. And actually, Demis Hassabis himself was a child prodigy at chess. He's fascinated in games themselves, but not for the sake of games. He's trying to develop systems that will in a sense, drive our future. So let us hear Dennis Usabis talking about this particular move, and I hope we've got the right video on here.
So I just want to explain to you a little bit about AlphaGo's play. Even though most of you may not know how to play Go, I think you can still appreciate what AlphaGo did. So this is a board position from game 2. And this is move 37, which is probably the most famous move in the match. And AlphaGo is black here. This is very early in the game, and Lisa Doll is white. And AlphaGo plays this move here on the right-hand side, outlined in red, this stone here. And the key thing to notice about where this stone has been placed is that it's on the 5th line. So you can see it's on the 5th line from the right-hand side of the board. The board's 19 by 19. Now, in the openings, if you're a professional, you almost always play on the 3rd or 4th lines. And that's the most important lines to be disputing early on in the game of Go. So to play on the 5th line this early on is kind of unthinkable. No professional player would even consider this move because it seems suboptimal and wasteful. And yet, AlphaGo decided to play here. And then it turned out the reason that AlphaGo played there was 100 moves later, these 2 stones here in the bottom left-hand corner that I ringed in red ended up, the kind of fighting on the bottom left here of the board, ended up spilling all the way into the middle of the board and moving all across the board, and then 100 moves later ended up connecting up perfectly with this stone on the right-hand side in move 37. And that ended up being decisive in that battle, and it won AlphaGo the whole game. Right? So somehow, it's as if AlphaGo had presciently understood this was going to happen and positioned that stone perfectly for 100 moves into the future. So, of course, the interesting thing is we can all think about, what is creativity, and I'm going to come and talk a little bit more about that in the latter part of this talk. But we could all play an original move in some sense, even if we didn't know how to play Go. We could all just play a random move on the board, and that would be surprising in some sense. But the key thing about Go is, although it's considered to be an art form, it's like objective art. So a move is only considered original and creative if it ends up being effective. And you can measure the effectiveness by obviously seeing the result of the game and then studying that afterwards and seeing if that move really had a material difference to the outcome. And you don't have to take just my word for it. You can see this. I'm just going to play this very short but funny clip from the live commentary stream that was going out to the millions of players. They will be watching this on YouTube. And on the right-hand side here is the strongest player the West has ever produced, Michael Redman, who's a 9-dan professional. And his reaction, he's watching the game live and commentating on it, to seeing this move 37. So hopefully you'll be able to hear.
The Google team was talking about is this kind of evaluation value.
That's a very surprising move.
I thought it was a mistake.
So you can hear there, he thought it was a mistake, and he goes on to say later in that clip that he thought it was a misclick. So he thought our computer operator had actually clicked the wrong place on the board, the computer board, because he couldn't believe that AlphaGo would play that move.
What I find interesting about this, the fact that we humans were not able to even understand that move at the time, is that this had been predicted by Alan Turing. Before even the term AI had been coined, a few years before it. And he's not necessarily talking necessarily about AI, he's talking about computation in general, where he's saying that I think he thinks that he could compose many things, he could do a lot of things, and even compose sonnets. But then he makes this comment, which is a little bit strange. I thought it was strange at the time. I didn't understand what he meant by this, but now I do. Though the comparison is a little bit unfair, perhaps, because a sonnet written by a machine would be best appreciated by another machine. I don't think machines can actually appreciate sonnets. I don't think that's a wrong term. But nonetheless, the idea that somehow that computers could operate at a level beyond human comprehension is, I think, the point that actually Alan Turing had predicted. And of course, we see an echo of this in the debate or the discussion between Elon Musk and Jack Ma that also, I think, took place, in 2019, where Jack Ma makes the kind of naive comment that human beings can never create another thing that is smarter than human beings. And Elon Musk corrects him. The biggest mistake I see people making is to assume they're smart. They sort of think that AI is a smart human, but it's going to be much smarter than the smartest human you will ever know. No, that is he absolutely. I mean, I don't know if we can use the word smart, but certainly the capabilities are going to be beyond those of humans. There is a term for this, the way in which we didn't recognize the ability of Move 37 or indeed AI in general, and that's called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. I mean, a paraphrase of this would be to say the dumb don't know how dumb they are. But I want to change that and say that actually the intelligent don't know how dumb they are. And this is really a problem in terms of even trying to understand what AI can do. And it applies not just the question of let's say, intelligence as such, but also to the question of creativity that I will mention a bit later. AI, I want to say, is operating at a level that we humans just simply can't comprehend. What we need, and I wrote an article about this called the Second Copernican Revolution. I think that's going to be a title in the Black Book. And that's basically, we need to kind of, if Nicholas Copernicus was responsible for the first Copernican Revolution, of basically pointing out that the universe didn't revolve around the Earth, rather the Earth revolved around the sun. Basically, the universe doesn't revolve around human beings. We are not the center of the universe. And indeed, in terms of ranges of intelligence, there are many. The world of AI, computers go way beyond us. Just as dogs have a greater sense of smell or hearing than human beings, and we therefore need to, I think, go through this kind of second Copernican revolution to realize we are not the center of the universe. If the whole all human life on the planet gets wiped out by COVID, the universe will go on regardless. We are not the center of everything, and it's a kind of wake-up call to us human beings. So I want to just focus on the question about creativity, which is something that's one of the most interesting aspects, I think, of what AI provokes. Certainly most of the discussions I've been involved in have ended up engaging with this question about creativity. What is creativity?
But let's think about creativity sort of more generally. Here's another definition of creativity that I think I got out of the Oxford Dictionary: the ability to use skill and imagination to produce something new. And I think there are at least three types of creativity, or three levels of creativity, if you like. So the first type, if you imagine that you're given three or more examples in a particular topic. And let's imagine for the moment that the green dots are these examples, and the white box is a particular topic or field of endeavor. And you're asked to create something new. So one way you could do that is what I call interpolation. And it's used often in machine learning and AI as an AI term. And interpolation you can think of as kind of like an averaging. So, here are three training examples, here are three examples of things we would like from this world of possibilities, and you kind of find an average of those things. And in some sense, that orange dot is new, right? It's different from the examples, and it's something new. But it's still sort of contained within the space, this green dotted green line, the space that the examples cover. The next level of creativity, which is a higher level of creativity, would be extrapolation. So now you have those examples, but instead of just finding an average, you're extending the boundaries of what you already know. So this would be the blue dots, and you can see those three blue dots as outside of the boundaries that's sort of marked out by the training examples, the green dots. And then finally, there's what I would call invention or innovation, which is here represented by the yellow dot that's outside the white box completely. And this is something completely new, perhaps informed in some way by what's inside the box. Now, how are we doing on the AI front with these levels of creativity? So let's examine machine creativity. And neural network systems, the kind of systems I showed you, sometimes the fashionable ones are called deep learning these days. They're pretty good at interpolation. They're massive statistical machines, if you like, and they're very good at averaging things and spotting patterns in data. Then you have things, AlphaGo-like systems, which are getting pretty good, I would say, at extrapolation. Finding new things beyond the boundaries of even what the human designers knew about, but still within the same general context. And then you've got true invention, which I think no AI systems are anywhere close to yet, right? So this would be, instead of coming up with an original move in Go, it would be inventing Go. right, or inventing chess. And there's no systems that are able to do that, right? We can come up with, I think AlphaGo definitely demonstrated extrapolation. It wasn't just averaging what humans have done before or mimicking what humans have done before. It was coming up with genuinely new ideas, but it can't invent something truly new. But let's think.
Okay. So, I mean, I find, I mean, Dennis Sapp is a genius. I find him really interesting in what he's saying. But what is that? Is that the correct understanding of creativity? I mean, I should say that that Margaret Bowden has also come up with three forms of creativity that are slightly different, but still three forms. I'm not quite sure whether he followed Margaret Bowden. I suspect that Margaret Bowden was referring to symbolic AI, therefore she has a different set of categories. Clearly, Dennis Sapp is referring to deep mind, to deep learning. And I'd also question actually whether you don't get to extrapolation through more simple means through deep learning. And I think that maybe cycle GANs could do that. They're not just working with an averaging, they're breeding one system off against another. But I think that both of these are making mistakes in the sense of they're judging AI on the basis of the product, the result, and that to my mind they're judging creativity in terms of the creative product. I've got lots of problems with that notion. This is a kind of comment by Lisa Doll that AlphaGo showed us that moves humans may have thought are creative were actually conventional. It was they saw the AlphaGo as being creative. My question I want to ask later on is, well, was it creative? Anyway, I think we need to kind of at least start rethinking creativity, at least start rethinking the Margaret Bowden or Demis Hassabis notion of creativity, because it seems so utterly inadequate. Arthur Miller, who's actually from the UCL, came up with a response that was very similar to the one I'd already come up with myself. The problem was that she was focusing on the product rather than the process. I mean, what is creativity? It's a difficult kind of question to address. Is it is it to do with the product, or is it to do with the process, the way we're kind of working away with the affordances of the tools that we have and producing something? Is it something that resides within the sensibility of the creative agent, the designer or something, who is probably expressing that creativity in any number of ways, the kind of food they cook and God knows what else? Or is it in the eye of the beholder, like beauty? And it's a challenge, because I mean, what happens? Say, I mean, Van Gogh, for example, wasn't recognized in his time. So was he creative? So there are all these different sort of questions that need to be raised about the issue of creativity. I don't know what the answer is, and it's a really complex question. Anil Seth says that creativity is even more complex than addressing the question of consciousness, but it's something that I'm fascinated by personally, and I intend to look at further. One of the comments that Melanie Mitchell makes is that, well, hold on a second, and this is a very good book, by the way, I recommend it. Melanie Mitchell says, well, but hold on a second, in order to be creative, you've got to know you've been creative. In other words, you've got to be self-aware, you've got to be sentient, you've got to have consciousness. Well, of course, AI doesn't have consciousness, therefore the argument would be, therefore it can't be creative. And to some extent, I agree with that. I agree with that. But what I would also say, and this is a comment made by Max Tegmark, also a very good book, to say that actually we're not always conscious of what we're doing in the first place. So some things happen as a kind of habit or a reflex. I don't know, a fly buzzing you and you blink or something. There are different ways of operating, and maybe we're not fully conscious when we're being creative. I tend to think that we're not at all. I think that the kind of light bulb moment where something occurs to us. In other words, we're not in charge of it. It occurs to us. It suddenly comes to us, and then afterwards, consciousness kicks in. We say, "Well, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. I'll go with that one. That's a good idea." So there is this open question: what is creativity? And I want to answer another question, which is maybe a tough question to ask, but I think it's a good one. Are human beings so creative? We think we are, and we think that AI is not as good as us because it's not as creative as us, but are we that creative? I wrote an article once for an AD on that Wendy Falk and Antoine Picon edited on digital property, where they're worried about the danger of people copying copyright in an age of computation. And I wrote the counterpoint. Of course, the counterpoint's got to argue the opposite of everything. So I did that, and I was given 24 hours to write this, and I actually copied myself in some senses. I copied the quotes from Camouflage, and I threaded them together with a different narrative. And my argument was that actually copying is fundamental to how we operate, and there are many examples of mimesis, of mimicry, that suggest that the way that things happen is by catching on. You're copying other people. Someone's humming a tune, you hum the same tune. Someone wears a certain baseball cap, you wear it. Someone's wearing Nike shoes, you buy a pair of them. We copy. That's the way that happens naturally. That's the way that culture propagates itself. And in fact, that's a comment that Adorno makes. The human is indissolubly linked to imitation. The human being becomes human at all by imitating other human beings. And I won't go into that, but that's a fascinating comment in itself. I would simply say that if you think about what's happening in architecture, it's a little bit like what happens in jazz. If you do something completely outlandish, outrageous, that doesn't fall within your conception of architecture. Let's say if you're a student and you design a building like a pineapple. I mean, everyone will say that's rubbish. That's not architecture. And yet, if you were to do something that was kind of a little like Zaha Hadid or Rem Koolhaas or Renzo Piano or any of those guys, right? But not the same, because it would be literal copy. If it's a little like that, then that's architecture. That's what we do. It's kind of like you've got to keep close enough to the canon of architecture. So hence I often refer to this in terms of jazz, the idea there's a background condition of which you're playing, but you somehow don't depart from it completely, and you come back to it in some sense. It's architecture in that sense is kind of just doing something that's just a slight variation on the canon. And this is exactly what happens with Ahmed Gamal's Cannes creative adversarial networks, where he uses them to generate artworks on the basis of the fact that actually with an artwork, it's a slight variation on it's a particular kind of GAN, but it's one where it's acknowledging that the canon, as it were, but stepping slightly outside it. But stepping slightly outside it, but not in a sense that it's unrecognizable. So this kind of painting, Ich bin ein Berliner, is kind of typical of the kind of work that can come out. So he's somehow recognized, I think, what I recognize as well, the fact that architecture is a kind of a question of copying. And of course, there are game changers. There are a few buildings that really are not copying anyone. They kind of establish a new genre. I think that the Guggenheim in Bilbao is one such building for all sorts of reasons I'm not going to now, but it certainly was a game changer itself. But then what do you find? You find that actually that Gary's, in a sense, copying himself in many of his subsequent buildings. He's actually got a kind of signature that he's developed, and it's not really that different. It's always instantly recognizable. And I want to therefore suggest that we need to take that notion of the signature, not just simply the literal signature of your name, but actually of your different habits, shall we say, and realize that they're very clearly identifiable. If you hear someone speak that you instantly recognize who it is. If you see someone, even if you can't necessarily see full details of someone walking or running or jogging, and you know how they walk or they run or they jog, you immediately recognize them. Everyone is immediately recognizable because we have these kind of signatures, these kind of habits or patterns of traditional ways of operating. And hence, I liken this to the game of chess, where the pieces on the chessboard can only move in a certain way. They can only move in a certain way based on what they've been ascribed in terms of their abilities, but so too do humans in many ways. And the pawn, for example, can't move backwards. And one thinks of certain American politicians who could never retract a statement and therefore became very vulnerable, just like a pawn. Some people just simply can't retract. They just double down on what they've said, and so on and so on and so on. So I don't think that we humans are quite as creative as we think we are. We follow habits and patterns and so on. Now, here I want to be even more provocative. I want to say, well, hold on a second. Wait. Are we really even talking? Is there any such thing as creativity? Now, that's a provocative comment to make, of course, but I want to go back to this comment by Lisa Doll. AlphaGo showed us that moves humans may have thought are creative were actually conventional. Now, that term "thought" is incredibly suggestive. It suggests that creativity is a matter of perception. What you perceive something as, whether or not you perceive something as being creative. In other words, creativity in this sense is in the mind of the beholder. But it's interesting because then you think, well, what do you mean by thought? And I think the whole question about creativity itself, we've got to be really careful to avoid the danger of anthropomorphization when it comes to all these questions: creativity, intelligence, learning, all the terms that are used in AI, where we somehow ascribe to them or describe them, shall we say, in terms of human attributes. I'm showing you here this a very famous psychological experiment from the 1940s. Simmel and Herder, I forget the name now, which was basically they tested people out with this video, and what we're seeing here basically are shapes on a screen: a large triangle, a small triangle, and a circle. And what it seemed, everyone would interpret it almost the same way. It seems that as though there's a kind of a contest, a battle going on, and the big triangle is bullying the circle, and the small triangle is coming to help the small circle. And that's the kind of the meaning, the narrative that we read into these things. But actually, they're just shapes on a screen. They're nothing like that at all. And one could even argue that the opposite holds true as well, to some extent, that we read ourselves in terms of machines sometimes. Anyway, so are they creative? Can we use this term creative? Can we even use the term learning? Can we use the term intelligence? Now, typically, because AI doesn't have consciousness, therefore we say, well, it can't think. It can't think. Well, okay, but then you say, well, hold on a second. Can you really be intelligent without thinking? And can you really be creative without thinking? And I'm not sure that one can. And I think that we really have to sort of question these terms, the terms that we use. We somehow see the world of computation in human in terms, and I don't think we should take it so easily. Now, I want to raise a question about that Costas Azidas makes in Permutation Design. And he makes this comment: what AI establishes above all else is that every possible move is already out there. It's simply a matter of searching for it. Now, Costas and I had a discussion about this in some hotel in Shanghai, and with Wan Yu He, who is one of my doctoral students and one of the world leaders in AI. And he had a plate of biscuits, what they call cookies in the States, biscuits, right? And he took one and he put it behind his back and he said, just because we can't see it doesn't mean to say it's not already there. And that's his argument, which is an interesting one, actually, the fact that all possible moves are out there. It's just a question of searching for them. Could we just say the same about creativity? Is it simply a question of searching? So, and here I want to refer to a comment made by Walter Benjamin about, in his work of art essay, about the question of aura. I'm never quite sure what aura means, but it seems to me to be some kind of magical quality, as though something has almost like a halo or some special condition or whatever. And of course, with the culture of reproducibility, that withers, that disappears entirely. You can reproduce things, and therefore aura gets taken out of the equation. Now, but I don't know. It sounds like a magical concept, aura. That's to my mind how I see it. Could we not maybe question it in the same way we could question magic? And this is a comment that I made in my book Millennium Culture, which came out in '99, years ago, about British culture. And what the comment I make there is actually there's no such thing as magic. Magic does not exist. And if you think about it, when you go to a kid's game, a kid's sort of a magic show, a magician comes along, and he or she, pulls a rabbit out of a hat, and it seems absolutely magical. And you think, wow, that's magical. But it's not magical. It's simply what's happening is that the magician is concealing the operations at work. It's actually quite straightforward. You don't see it. Now, could we not use the same towards creativity? we think it's like almost creative. Oh, that's so creative. A twinkle in the eye. You were really genius. Like, and same with the magician. Oh, you were such a clever magician. Well, no, not really. They're just hiding these things. So is there any such thing as creativity? And to maybe argue this point, I wanted to show you this. You've probably seen this before, the famous John Searle Chinese room argument. And he makes it basically to talk about really what's happening in terms of AI, in terms of consciousness. John Searle, a philosopher based in Berkeley, who criticizes AI because it hasn't got consciousness. And the way he argues it is a bit like this room. Two people outside who have received some manuscript, some text, and they're Chinese speakers. They, oh, that's clearly been produced by someone who speaks good Chinese. But actually, what's really happening is there's a person inside who doesn't understand Chinese at all, just following the rule book, following some algorithms, we could say, and the rule book's in English. But out of that, something comes out that is itself seems to be convincing Chinese. What if what was happening is with creativity the same? Some people are saying, oh, from the outside, it looks like it's being creative, but all it's doing is something entirely rational, following the rule book and just searching for something. I mean, can a computer really be creative? So I don't know the answer to that, but I think that we have to start asking some questions. So I want to then talk to the kind of look at the question, go back to the original title in some sense. How will AI transform architecture? And I want to refer to one quote that came out of this wonderful documentary. I really recommend this documentary. So you can find it on YouTube. These ideas that are driving AlphaGo are going to drive our future. And the question I want to ask is, how are they going to drive the future of architectural design? Because I think they absolutely are already. And I want to start with Wan Yu He, one of my doctoral students at FIU, who is, I mean, she's a world leader. She used to work for Rem Koolhaas and now has a company called X-Koolhaas. And she's now this is a groundbreaking software developer in Shenzhen in China, and they learned from AlphaGo Zero. That was the thing they really learned from. They suddenly realized that you could, without knowing the rules, you could hallucinate architecture. And this is an example of this building does not exist. A Stylegan's study that generating out of a data set of kind of modernist buildings. Clearly, it's generating other modernist buildings, which is somehow an architectural version of this person does not exist. There's a site you can go to and just type it in, this person does not exist. And it generates unbelievably lifelike faces, but they're not real. They don't exist. There's other sites. This cat does not exist, and so on you can go to. So already it's had an impact directly through AlphaGo Zero on her on this work. And I don't think I have time to go into X-Cool's work, but I was when you was showing me her work the other day, and I was blown away by it, by the possibilities. Because although we're seeing here modernist buildings, and much of their work, if you look at it, it kind of looks developer architecture. You say, oh, that's not good architecture. You can't do good architecture. But what they're doing now, they just won a competition against 200 architectural firms, where they produce more Gehry-like buildings based on performative environmental concerns, and then they use AI furthermore to kind of reduce the number of paneling types on this, and so on and so on. Suddenly, you can begin to realize that really, this is something to be scared about because it can actually do something truly astonishing. The other company I want to mention is Spacemaker AI, and one of the things about the world of AI, it moves so quickly that in the space of when I finished the manuscript to when I had to kind of like finalize it, Spacemaker had been bought up by Autodesk, so they're now part of Autodesk. And when you look at this, you think, well, this is kind of conventional architecture, wouldn't get very far at the bar, would it? But actually, what's interesting is not the style, but the way in which it was generated. And I don't think that actually Spacemaker are as advanced as X-Cool in terms of deep learning. But nonetheless, they're doing quite well. They were bought up for 240 million. Clearly, Autodesk takes them seriously. And Harvard Hoagland came up with this kind of comment, which in a discussion that we had on digital futures, which is absolutely so completely similar to Move 37 in Game 2. the place where architects thought it would be smart to build buildings, and places where they thought it would be smart to build dense wall, all the things that intuitively they thought would be smart because they had hundreds of projects of experience were flipped around. They were flipped around. In other words, the computer was coming up with something that was beyond human conception, even with experienced architects. And it was because the computer had the capacity to deal with the complex data of dealing with an urban planning scenario and to produce something that you would never have come up with yourself. You would never have come up with yourself. And this is the actual project that I think that he was referring to. Again, nothing outrageous in terms of what it looks like architecturally, but it's the manner that it was generated, which makes it unbelievably fascinating to me. But there's a second point that I want to, which is actually the more scary one, and this came out, and it's in the book. This is why I'm saying that AI is terrifyingly amazing, and how it's going to be a danger in some sense to the profession. And the point is that developers already are saying to their architects, we want you to use SpaceMaker AI. We want you to use AI. It's a requirement from the clients. Now, why is it a requirement from the clients? Because they can guarantee the maximum return on investment. AI is able to calculate, to operate at a level way beyond human capacity. So they're now saying, we want you to use AI. Well, what does that mean exactly? So what will be the future of architecture? I think that the other lesson that we have to learn is not just AlphaGo, but also from the self-driving car. That the model, it seems to me, if you put those together, you get something that is truly astonishing. I mean, the danger, of course, to kind of as a spoiler, is to say, well, if self-driving cars, you don't need a driver. If you've got AI, do you need an architect? But there's a comment made by Toby Walsh that I find really interesting. I mean, many of his predictions are a bit lame, but this one's interesting. He says we'll be banned from driving. We won't be able to drive cars anymore, and we will not notice or even care. Now, the logic is this. We start using self-driving cars because they're convenient. And we get used to them. They're very comfortable and so on. And as a result, we start losing our driving skills because we don't drive so much. Then, as a result of not having such great driving skills, our insurance premiums go up. And then we think, well, what the hell? I'll just take the self-driving car. And eventually, driving will fade out. And then he says, we will not even notice or even care. That, to my mind, is the interesting aspect that I think we need to interrogate. So I want to just mention the kind of some of the predictions about the future of architecture, and there are a number of things. They're all very confusing because nobody can agree on what they are, or indeed when they take place. But there are 4 stages broadly. One is when AI reaches human intelligence, and the next one is the singularity. That is the kind of explosion of intelligence that comes out. These are Ray Kurzweil's terms. Comes out as a result of the exponential growth in knowledge. And then there's AGI when AI achieves consciousness. And then finally, there's this term superintelligence or ultra intelligence that's been used to describe the moment when basically machines become so capable that they are able to design other machines, and human beings are just left out the loop, where we just simply we become redundant because they're able to do everything. Now, I think this is suspect for 2 reasons. Firstly, we can already see that the way in which these changes happen are really incremental. It's like a kind of incremental creep. If you look at the way that, for example, that a Tesla car became self-driving, it actually happened in a gradual through software updates until a certain moment, and I think it was somewhere around October of 2020, suddenly the car was self-driving. And so it happens through a sort of creep. It also happens at different speeds in different domains. So somewhere already AI is better than us at chess and Go. We know that, but not in other things. So it's difficult. Can you say there's one particular year when this will happen, or when these events will happen? No, I don't think so. And we might not even notice it at all. And one way to think about this is in terms of the way in which as they put it, as you put it, as people put it, you boil a frog. I would never want to boil a frog, but let me just tell you that the argument is, if you want to boil a frog, you just don't come with a pan of boiling water and throw the frog in it, because the frog will jump out. It's far too hot. What you do is you put the frog in sort of tepid sort of water, and you gradually increase the heat until the frog doesn't notice, and until at a certain point, it's boiled. Now I want to put that alongside the comment made by Andreas Huyssen, which is to say, we live in a culture of amnesia. In Twilight Memories, his book about it's kind of, I guess, Baudrillard adapted towards the question of memory. We've lost. We can't even remember very well these days. And if you think about it, in this contemporary culture, can we even remember when we didn't have cell phones or the internet or Wi-Fi or all those things? I mean, actually, it wasn't so long ago. Just over 20 years ago, we had a world of faxes. I mean, anyone use a fax these days? And yet we've completely forgotten about it. We didn't notice it. And I think, to my mind, that's a powerful combination. A culture of amnesia and this gradual creep, this boiling of frog logic of how things develop. Things will change and we won't even notice or care. When I was a student at Cambridge, I used to go on holiday, and I would go to SDA Travel. I don't know if they don't exist anymore. I'd go to SDA Travel. I'd queue up, and I'd talk to an agent, and he or she would plan out my thing and could send me a ticket by post the next day. And I'd go to a shop, a camera shop, and I would buy some reels of film. And then when I came back from my vacation, I would take my films and I would send them off to be processed somewhere. Well, none of that happens anymore. There are almost no travel agents. There are some, but almost no, because everyone books online. The camera shops are suffering because everyone's got cameras in their mobile phones, and you certainly don't get films processed in the way you did in the past, because everyone's using digital cameras. So things happen, and suddenly you realize that, I can't see any camera shops around. I can't see any film developers around, because things change and we don't often notice it. So that's my argument. We end up being in a situation whereby we don't even notice or care. And let me just take an example of Uber to explain what I mean, how that process will happen. With Uber, what's interesting is whether or not you need a driver. I mean, of course, it's nice to have a chat with a driver, but you've already punched in on your phone when you ordered Uber. You already punched in where you're going to go, and so this person just kind of clicks it into his satellite system or her satellite system and drives you there. And you don't actually need a driver. And of course, it's nice to have a conversation with a driver. But if you had the option of a self-driving car, or a self-driving car plus a driver, which would be more expensive, sure, you could have a chat with a driver, but it would be a very expensive chat with a driver. Now, think about this in terms of architecture. So what Harvard Hochland is saying is basically clients are insisting on architects using AI. So the same thing's happening in some ways. You're working with an architect and you're working with AI, but it's not going to be so far away when it comes to the situation when AI is so capable that many of the things it can't do, it will be able to do. It just makes logical sense that fairly soon you'll be able to say to AI, design me a building and just describe it, and it won't give you options so much as kind of know what you want in the first place, because it's been studying your data. And it'll come up with something that, just as Spotify comes up with things, or Amazon comes up with books that you would like, it's. I don't think that's so far away. So when you're in the situation whereby you've got the possibility of AI plus an architect, or just AI, which is going to be cheaper? Of course, it's nice to have an architect to have a chat with, but it's going to be a very expensive chat, and people, of course, are just going to use AI. At least that would be my prediction. So the question then is, what will happen then? And this is a provocation. Will we not be allowed to design buildings anymore, just as we're not allowed to design? Maybe not allowed to drive cars, and will we notice or even care? I guess the point being the same thing happens in terms of driving. that if you have to if you don't use AI, your professional indemnity insurance could go up, um, and the same would happen. Or self-driving car, your professional indemnity insurance could go up if you don't use AI. You might not produce the best design, and also, sorry, I'm saying it again. Okay, just with the self-driving car, if you don't use a self-driving car, your car insurance will go up. So with buildings, if you don't use AI, potentially your professional indemnity insurance will go up. And will we even notice or care? 50 years ago, there was a book published, 1972, called Learning from Las Vegas. To my mind, it is time for architects to learn not from Las Vegas, but from AI, because I think AI is going to change architecture far more than Las Vegas ever will. And what happened to Lisa Doll? In 2019, he retired from the game of Go on the basis of the fact that, as he put it, this is an entity that cannot be defeated. Is that a presage of the future for architects? I want to reveal now the title of my second book, which is not, the design is not correct, but the left-hand side is the title of my first book, The White Book, and the right-hand side is the title of my second book, the book with the black cover. The Death of the Architect, the Demise of the Profession of Architecture, the architecture profession in the age of AI. I mean, it's not just AI. I mean, architecture is suffering from all sorts of different things. I won't go into that now, but the position of the architect has really been undermined, and not least because more than 50% of architects in the UK are working for developers. The architect is not, as Alberti would put it, the person in charge, where the workman is a tool in the hand of the architect. No, the architect is a tool in the hand of the developers. Already, we're seeing this significant change. So, is it game over? Well, let me just say that yes and no. Of course, we've got self-driving cars now. We have them. They're available. But for certain moments, we want to spend more money on a ridiculously old-fashioned method of transport, a horse and cart, for weddings, for funerals, and so on. We do it for a particular reason. To have a chauffeur, and so on. There are certain reasons why we do certain things, even though we could do things otherwise. In other words, there will always be, for those who want it, who want to pay extra, a possibility of engaging with an architect. And I think, frankly, it's the star architects are the ones who are going to still be popular. And you think about the logic of brands, Prada, Gucci, and so on, ridiculously expensive. Why would anyone buy a handbag by Prada or Gucci? Well, actually, it's not because in fact, the point is they're not worried. People who buy these things are not worried about economies. They're worried about conspicuous consumption. They want to show they don't even care about money. And therefore, to my mind, I think that there'll still be a call for kind of the personal response of architects themselves. I want to finish with a comment by Wan Yu He. She was talking about this with me last week, and I was asking her. She doesn't want to let on exactly what she knows, but I was just pressing her and saying, "Well, what's happening now with this XCool software? How has the architect office been reduced?" And she commented that now it's what was done by 5 people is now done by one person. And I think the point is that most people, all the studies that have been done so far on AI versus humans, have made the mistake of comparing humans directly with AI, and they thought, well, okay, creative acts, AI can't do that. But we have to see AI not in terms of a discrete entity, but in terms of a form of extended intelligence, of how we can extend the capabilities of the architect through the use of this. So one person is now capable of doing what 5 people could do in the past. And that's already happening. In Zaha's office, even without very sophisticated software, they're already reducing staff in some areas because they don't need so many architects. My point being simply is that in this game of Squid Game, not everybody dies. Not everyone dies. There's always one survivor. Now, whether we see this in terms of the star architect as the one architect that survives, or the one person out of 5 that will be surviving in the scenario that Wan Yu is predicting. It's still in some ways the same question, and that's only a temporary solution because okay, fine, with one person to do what five can do, as soon as AI becomes capable, then we won't even need the architects. So to my mind, I don't know what the solution is, but I think in terms of the issue, we need to realize that it's important to recognize the problem because once a problem is perceived as a kind of problem, it becomes something with which we can deal. And we architects who are completely nostalgic in the way that we address the future, with the way we address architecture. I mean, look at all the courses on history that are going on in schools of architecture. I don't know a single school, apart from maybe Liam Young in SciArc, is doing studies of the future. Why are we not addressing the future? It's important for architects to address the future. Every building we do is somehow premised on the possibility that it could be built in the future. Every design that we do, it could be built in the future. What we need to do now is to look to the future and to design our own profession because it's very clear what's on the horizon. And without wishing to panic you, I think we need to at least be aware of the problem. Hence, Squid Games. Okay.
Well, well, thank you very much, Neil, for your amazing presentation. Well, now it's time to our audience. If anyone wants to ask something, yeah. Any questions?
I'm getting an echo here, so.
No questions, guys? So well, if no one wants to ask something, maybe may I ask something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, it's quite fascinating, all this the link between AI, all the possibilities that we are now facing in terms of how the profession could change during the next year. So from now until now, is changing a lot. So maybe in terms of the profession, because right now we are for instance, from the academia, we are in the top, let's say in the top of this pyramid of knowledge, trying to push the boundaries of what we are doing. So do you think that this is the transformation of our discipline in terms of our practice is going to change soon, thanks to AI?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think I would refer to.
You are mute. You're mute.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. So, firstly, I think that we need to recognize there's a difference between the discipline and the profession. The discipline is something that actually the Bartlett's very good at, right? It's kind of like it's the academic world where it's kind of experimental and unconstrained, and it's kind of proliferating. I think it's going crazy in some senses. And then there's profession itself there's much more narrow, that exists in terms of a certain world with the profits and things, and you can't really experiment, and a different logic entirely. And it's pretty much to do with kind of building at the moment. And I think I've always thought that really the challenge is to go for what I would call other architectures. In other words, what we as architects can do is to actually use the skill set that we've got in many other areas. I think that there's something unique about architecture education in the sense that you can learn to design, you learn to think in 3 dimensions, you learn to understand material behavior. And I don't think there's really any other discipline that can do quite all those things. And what's happening, of course, is other people moving into other areas. I mean, in LA, we have a bunch of people who are, God knows what they're doing. They're making movies. They're 3D printing in sugar. They're making, like Greg Lynn, making robots that follow you around when you go shopping. And in fact, Benaz Farahi and I, we published an AD 2017 called 3D printed body architecture, because we recognized that there were all the people who were working for Iris van Herpen, including Nicolo Casas, who was doing a PhD, I don't know if he still is, at the Bartlett, were architects, and we have a skill set. So Neri Oxman, Nicolo Casas, and so on and so on. and so we call this 3D printed body architecture because it was a form of architectural possibility. So I think there are other architectures we could get into that potentially would allow opening up the possibility of what architecture might be. And I noticed that the RIBA produced a study, which I thought was kind of incredibly honest, actually, back in 2012, 13, I think it was, where some architects said that the term architect is actually a bit obsolete. It doesn't really describe what they do, and therefore it was maybe the term was going to disappear. And of course, the term has been taken over by computer science anyway. But so maybe there's another way in which we could use those skills as architects and find some other way of operating. But I certainly think, as architects, if we've got anything to design, it is to design the future of our profession. And I think how we could use those skills.
Excellent. Yeah. So maybe I have an additional question, just because it's really interesting what is happening with AI from since the last year till now, and it's about we must wait some milestone in terms of AI and architecture, like what, for instance, what happened in the 90s with Gary and this fish sculpture that he designed in Barcelona. Because from the historical perspective, that was a milestone in terms of the link between architecture and digital design. So we are waiting for something like that. Do you think that it's already happening?
No, I think it's already happened. I mean, just to say, I'm an architect, right? I've been trained as an architect. I'm not a computer scientist, but I'm registered in the UK. You can find me in the ARB list. But I think I'm a theorist, and I think you need to sort of step outside and to see things in perspective. And for when I was working on Alberti, for example, I was so immersed in the world of Alberti that Gordana Corradino asked me to invited me to give a lecture at the AA, and I said I can't do that. I was caught up in the mechanics of the language itself, and sometimes I think maybe as an architectural theorist you can point things out that people don't know as at the coalface. But certainly there are things that people don't know because they're not aware of them because they're happening in China. But I would say what I've seen from Wan Yu He is I tell you, it's absolutely astonishing. Forget BIM, forget all these things. They're creating this thing called ABC, a single platform where everything is done at one level. And as I say, some of the designs they're coming up with are just astonishing. So the writing's on the wall. I mean, the writing's on the wall, and we need to engage with it. But I think for sure the profession of architecture is the first thing to suffer. Or actually, rather, within the profession of architecture, the RIBA is going to go straight away. I mean, bots don't need to be members of the RIBA, right? And without the economic, without contributing their fees, then the RIBA will go, and all these things. So these systems will gradually erode. Mark Garcia's got a question.
Hi, yeah, sure. Good morning, Neil. Thank you very much for your talk, firstly. You present many great arguments and points and evidence, and I support broadly your views and conclusions. But you said two things in your earlier response, and you said, I'm an architect, but I'm also a theorist. And I think for me, what I was intrigued about, what your lecture provoked, was really the question, are we also seeing the death, not just of the architect, but of the architectural theorist and historian? And are you worried for your job, in other words?
I think we should all be worried for our jobs, frankly. I mean, I've been teaching completely online, and I've been producing these kind of TED Talk like things, and I realized that I don't need to do the games for 4 or 5 years. But no, okay. So actually, no, I actually strangely not. I mean, first of all, I think the history has had its time in some ways. I think largely, I don't want to be critical here, but it's kind of belongs to the postmodern agenda in some sense. That obsession with history, the kind of Tony Vidler and all that kind of stuff that was going on. I think we're interested in different questions right now. Environmental questions. All those kind of other issues that are coming in. But actually, in terms of theory, I would say the exact opposite. In other words, I think, I shifted. Rethinking Architecture came out in 97. My last book about cultural theory as such was Camouflage, came out in 2006. And I shifted, I thought, well, because I was teaching at these kind of progressive schools like Columbia, the AA, SciAC, and so on, I thought, well, I need to try and not just talk about Derrida and Foucault and all this kind of fascinating stuff, but think about how you could deploy theory in the arena of computation. And I've struggled. I mean, frankly, I've struggled for a long time in the sense that some aspects of computation you just simply can't theorize. I mean, how do you theorize a robotic arm moving forward and backwards? I don't know. I mean, you can theorize the possibility of cyborg cultures, of the interface, human interface, of course, and that's really where the areas I think I would want to point towards. But actually, now all of a sudden, a new debate has appeared on the horizon that is deeply theoretical. I mean, the whole question about consciousness is right both in the domain of philosophy and neuroscience. And in the book I refer to Anil Seth in particular, and this is a guy whose ideas are mind-blowing in terms of revolutionizing how we as humans operate. And you can see connections between neuroscience and AI. I mean, frankly, what neuroscientists and what AI people are looking at are exactly the same thing, which is to say intelligence. The quest for AI is the quest for intelligence itself. So it's, there is absolutely, completely a theoretical agenda. So I can see a new awakening in some senses for theory, because this has really been what I've been waiting for. I feel so energized by the kind of theoretical question that it provokes. And although I didn't go into it now, well, maybe I did actually in some senses. I think we can see the world of computation as being, or the world of AI as being a mirror in which to understand what it is to be human. I mean, there was an exhibition at the Barbican 2 or 3 years ago, More Than Human, where that comment was made. It becomes a mirror in which we can understand ourselves. And that, to my mind, is really what I'm interested in, is how do we, in AI, begin to understand the human, just as in the sense the logic of Craig Reynolds and the Boyds. It was through modeling the behavior of birds, the swarming, flocking behavior of birds, that Craig Reynolds, well, he had to understand it in order to go and write an algorithm, right? And he taught biologists how to understand this. I mean, up until then, biologists didn't know about why birds flocked as they did. So, to my mind, I think we can see the possibility of AI opening up questions about what we do ourselves. I want to challenge. I don't know. I've still yet to be convinced about this. I don't think we're creative. I don't think creativity is not a useful term at all. Lev Manovich wrote about this as a recent invention, creativity. And it seems to me a kind of quasi-magical term. I would first of all question whether or not these terms are so useful. Are we not conducting a search when we find a solution? So I think it's time to be provocative in some senses and to ask some tough questions. But I do think actually that it doesn't cancel out theory. It shows how theory itself can be incredibly interesting. But I would say one thing is I think that we've operated in a kind of paradigm shift. In other words, back in the 90s, it was all about continental philosophy, essentially. Certainly the AA, where I was teaching, it was all about those debates. And now it's gone from the literary theory into cognitive sciences, so neuroscience, AI, a form of philosophy. You think about Andy Clark, his Natural Born Cyborgs or Surfing Uncertainty. It's gone. There's a different kind of debate that is the master's debate beyond philosophy itself. And I think these things are really, really provoking us in interesting ways. And what I think is so provocative, I didn't mention it today, but how we can take the kind of the notion that Anil Seth has about how we hallucinate our realities. Our version of reality is our interpretation of reality is a form of controlled hallucination. How does that connect with the hallucinations that come out of AI itself, of AI itself? So I think, not for theory. I think history is going to struggle, but theory is going to come alive. It's going to be energized by these things.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, what I really had in mind here was also, firstly, I agree, but what I had in mind was your own use of AI for theory and what you mentioned, which is a particular interest of mine, kind of futures, right? Prognostic, projective, predictive, and kind of proleptic theory, as it were. Do you use, I'm thinking of Marcus de Sautoy's book, The Creativity Code, where halfway through the book, he tells you that actually the previous chapter that you've just read was written by an AI. So I'm talking about those uses of AI directly. And then the second example I'm thinking about is the use of AI by Lev Manovich, so cultural analytics. So the AI actually looks through images and processes the images, and then gives you a kind of theoretical analysis. I mean, what do you think of Lev Manovich's work and Marcus de Sauter's work in respect to AI and the history and theory? Sorry, theory and futures in particular.
Yeah. There's actually the most interesting one is GPT-3, to my mind. This natural language processing, which is produced. There was an interview done with David Chalmers, and it's a different lecture, this right. But if you look at it, you think you would not believe. And it's called. It's Dave being interviewed, but actually it's GPT-3. And you wouldn't believe it was GPT-3. It's just astonishing. And there's a whole debate about GPT-3, which I think is astonishing. And certainly, of course, Clip is coming out of GPT-3 as well. I lost my train of thinking here. So I think that what was the question again? Just remind me, just one sentence, Mark. Sorry.
Yeah, the use of AI and maybe your own use of AI in theory and futures. So and I mentioned de Sauter and then also Lev Manovich's work.
Right. I think Marcus de Sauter does buy into Margaret Bowden's notion of creativity, which I think is a big mistake. Lev has been doing this project. I don't know much. I mean, I know Lev because he used to. He's in Southern California. Well, he was in San Diego, Southern California. I'm not sure to what extent he's using deep learning actually in his cultural analytics. I don't know. But I think what I would say, the person I think who is actually most interesting, is Liam Young, who I knew from the AA, who's now I think having really making interesting impacts, because what he does is he picks up on emerging trends and weak signals and starts predicting the future. And I've always been fascinated by the future myself, so I share that with you. I think it's fascinating, and you can. I don't know the thing about prediction though, because I in Millennium Culture, which is a book that kind of sank because the publishers went bankrupt. But you make predictions, and it's kind of interesting because if you get it wrong, people laugh at you. Oh, you thought that. Like Blade Runner with Rachel smoking, and that doesn't happen in 2019, right? But if you get it right, you think, well, it was obvious, wasn't it? And there's a wonderful prediction that Ray Kurzweil makes about. He made it in 1983, and he said, well, by 2000, I can't remember what it was. He said we're going to have a situation where school kids we're going to access all the libraries in the world through their laptops and their satchels, and you think, well, of course, that's so obvious. I mean, so dumb. Of course it was so obvious that, but it wasn't in 1983. That was when we had faxes. We had no clue this was going to happen, and that's interesting because the same happened with rethinking architecture. It was someone said, "Oh, that was predictable. Someone was going to do that." Well, they hadn't done it. So I don't know. I share with you the fascination about the future. I think it's really amazing, but it's challenging. It's challenging. But I think we should be doing this as architects. I mean, especially those of us who are teaching in schools of architecture, students who are going to be at the peak of their profession when all these things are going to be happening. And they won't happen in one moment like the explosion of singularity, but by the time they're in the peak of their profession, they're going to be in a different sort of domain. So we have to teach them for that. Some of these crazy, obsolete ways of thinking are just out of date. And what I don't understand is this is the interesting thing, is going back to your question about historians and theorists, why so many from the domain of history and theory are so negative about computation and AI. I really don't understand why that is. It's a mystery to me as why all Republicans don't want to get vaccinated. It's one of these kind of strange mysteries of our time. But I was at Cambridge, right? I studied at Cambridge where Dalibor Vasley, banned computers from his studio. So what happened? There was a generation of students coming out of Cambridge who were completely unemployable because you had to have computers. And I actually found out about really the potential of computers when I was working on Alberti, and I was working in the computer science department in Cambridge. It was amazing. It was right on top of the building above the Babbage lecture theatre. I didn't know who Babbage was, Charles Babbage then, but of course he was a major figure in terms of the history of computation. And I was working there, and Joseph had said to me, because it was 1988, the book came out, it was still in postmodern, he said, well, let's write in this particular style. And actually, what happened is that as I was writing, as I was translating Alberti and revising probably every sentence 25 times, and you couldn't do that in the days of typewriters and Tipex and things. You could revise it and revise it and revise it, and actually, a kind of pithy style of language came out as a result of that process. And suddenly that changed. So I began to realize the power of computation then, not least, of course, because I was surrounded by these incredible geeks, they were fascinating individuals who were doing the most bizarre things on their computers, the computer science department. It was really, really amazing. And I could see it then. But down the road in the School of Architecture, they were preaching, no, 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 this is evil. This is kind of, and technology is alienating and all this kind of nonsense, And so I don't know. I think I just wish that historians and theorists, I don't know what it's like in the Bartlett, but I really wish that they would engage with these ideas and understand that this is actually fascinating terrain in which to kind of theorize. It's something I'm completely energized by this, absolutely energized by it. I've got 3 books coming out, 2 more after this one, and I want to write 3 or 4 more just exploring these terms, because suddenly there's a new theoretical horizon out there that is absolutely fascinating and challenging.
Thank you. No, I share your very, very clear and infectious enthusiasm for the topic. Thank you. Those are very full and rich responses. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Good to see you again.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah. Oh, echoes again. Okay. So we have still have a few more questions from the chat. Yeah, if we have a chat. So the first one is from Eva. Isn't that AI actually brings the urgent in focusing on designing the design itself rather than the reproduction of the style and generic architecture? Do you see that this as an opportunity in a way that it would actually bring the aura back for our discipline?
Hi, Eva. I think this is Eva from the AA. No, I wouldn't use the term aura. I think these are terms which are just, we use them because we don't understand what's happening, right? I mean, for sure, it's. I don't know whether, but certainly, I think there's a domain of creativity, or well, okay, even, and I'm not sure I could use the word creativity anymore. But I think that we're now empowered, and we can produce so much more. I guess I like the kind of comment that Elon Musk makes: is we're all superhuman now because we got an extension of in terms of our phone and things and these devices and so on. So I think what the question answered to my mind is, it's a question of stages, because we're going to shift from one stage to another. And initially, what's going to be interesting is how empowered we are to be able to do more things. That one person in an office can do what 5 people or even 20 people could do before, just by using AI as an extension of themselves. And that'll be a great moment. That'll be a great moment, and it'll be useful and so on. But everyone who's working in the field, not architecture that is, but in the field of looking at the impact of automation and AI, is saying, but eventually, it'll be able to do everything. And so that'll be that. Yeah, I would want to avoid those terms. I haven't really thought that through enough, but I certainly wouldn't want to use the word aura. I certainly would be suspicious of the word creativity. I think we need to. I think everything is understandable if you describe it in the right way, and if you resort to these kind of seemingly magical terms. I think that you're just simply mystifying things, and we've got to be entirely logical in how we approach this. So I would avoid those terms myself. Did I answer your question, Eva? Oh, okay. She's following the live stream.
But and the last one is AI in architecture inevitably and inherently leading to a post-human architecture?
Okay, let me. Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, I know there's someone in the Bartlett who talks about post-human. I don't. And the reason I don't is explained actually in the introduction to the book. There's actually there's a kind of genealogy, shall we say, to how we might think about the role of AI as a form of extended intelligence. So you can start off with the kind of Heideggerian perspective, which is ridiculous. That there are things out there, we either engage with them or we don't, and they're kind of static and whatever. But the much more productive approach is to think about them in terms of Merleau-Ponty, in terms of the appropriation of these tools within the body schema. And I know that Jonathan Hale's written about this, and Merleau-Ponty it just takes you way beyond Heidegger and his thinking about tools, which is, I don't know. Graham Harman talks a lot about. He did his PhD on that thing, and I don't know why SAC employs someone like that who's so old-fashioned. But anyway, but then beyond Merleau-Ponty, you get Andy Clark, who's just down in Brighton, right? And he's a friend of mine. And he basically talks and said, well, actually, hold on a second. And he uses this idea. I mean, that there's an essay he wrote with David Chalmers called Extended Mind, where he talks about how you use a notepad. If you're suffering from if you memory loss and things, you note things down in the notepad as opposed to memorizing them. You say, well, isn't that part of your extended mind? And that leads to the kind of extension of the comment about Elon Musk about being superhuman because he's got these other entities. And then then the critique comes from now I'm just blanking on her name now, who writes about the post-human, an American philosopher. It'll come back to me. Sorry, a bit jet lagged. But she says that we're now that's making us kind of put into a post-human domain. We're relying on these other things, and Andy Clark says no, absolutely not. It's because we are human and because of the plasticity of the human brain that we are natural-born cyborgs, and therefore we can adapt to these tools. So that's my position. I mean, post-human. I mean, another comment about post-human, I'm sorry, whoever researches this area, the comment about post-human is that when you come across it, people basically have to explain it. I mean, it doesn't mean post-human, it means something else. Well, if you need a complex definition to tell you what the word means, it's not a very good term in itself. And the danger is that you take it literally as meaning kind of post-human. So I don't know, I never use the term post-human. I think I follow Andy Clark. I think we're actually, it's the plasticity of the human mind. We never get beyond the human. It's still the human at the center in some senses. It's just that we have this we're capability of absorbing tools within our body schema and using them and thinking through them and so on and so on. So I don't use the word post-human. I'm going to be very popular now. People are going to attack me. People are going to attack me about the book anyway, right? Not just the conservatives and people have been left out and whatever. But anyway, I don't mind being attacked. But no, I just, let me put that provocation there. I did write something for Acadia about the post-human where I made similar points. Yeah.
Again, oh, the heck, yeah, thank you. Well, still have a last one for Eva again. Donna Haraway. She asked.
It's not Donna Haraway. It's the other one. God. No, I could probably find it if I went to the book itself and just looked it up. But it's not Donna Haraway. It's she gave a talk. She was due to give a talk at Acadia this year, and I forget what her name is. But I think the whole discourse. I mean, Donna Haraway was preceded Andy Clark because she was talking about cyborgs well before Andy Clark was. But we build upon that. Let me just try and find this other thing here. Excuse me a second. I just.
Rosie Raidotti?
No, not Rosie. Catherine Hales. Who is great. I mean, she's great. Fantastic. I heard her talk at SciArc. Not Rosie Borty. She's a Deleuzian theorist. Anyway, I just think that we have this new domain, which is really opening interesting questions. Now, I just think to my mind, they're theoretical questions. And if you can step back a bit and think about this, I mean, I'm just, I guess I was studied at Cambridge, and I was taught by Catherine Cook, and I was really bored by my history lectures until Catherine came on and gave us these lectures on Russian constructivism, and her passion spilt over, and I ended up doing Alberti, not because of Alberti, because of the Russian constructivists, the ideas that actually, if you look at the kind of historical questions with enough imagination, they can become fascinating. And I think from a theoretical perspective, that this is a fascinating new domain that is really ripe for potential, and in terms of intellectual inquiry. I'm just blown away by it. I think it's amazing.
Well, and well, thank you very much, I think, Neil, for this amazing morning here in London. It was really inspiring, everything, what we watched, as well, everything related with this conversation later. Just thank you very much for being here with us and for sharing this morning here again. And thank you to all of you, because it was really interesting, the conversation that happened here. So has been a pleasure. Thank you very much again. Yes, and he's going to, it's okay, here. Yes, I'm sharing again the audio.
I can just see on the chat there's someone called Selda, who's an Iranian architect who's studying in Cardiff. And what this week is special, not just because of these books and this talk and things and flying from LA to here and being jet lagged and whatever else, but this week we had our first ever Digital Futures Arabic session on Tuesday, and it was mind-blowing. And later today, we have our first ever Digital Future session in Farsi. And it's so, this is another area which I think, the Digital Future, which is something I helped to co-found, but suddenly a year and a half ago, we realized, wow, this is a new domain in which we can operate. So the combination of AI and that digital platform and things are going to be, I think, hopefully very intense in terms of the debates going on. But I'm really looking forward this afternoon to the first Digital Future Farsi session, because there's so many super talented Iranian architects in the Iranian diaspora. Anyway, that's just a little plug for that.
Well, yeah, so thank you very much. Let's be in touch for maybe more seminars the next year here in this architectural digital theory program from UCL Bartlett. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year's, and for sure a better 2022. Bye bye to all of us.